The day Peter Barlow rode into Coldwater Creek, the sky above the New Mexico territory was the color of a bruise healing slowly, and every soul in town felt the particular weight of a stranger who had no intention of leaving. It was the spring of 1878, a year when the territory was still raw and wild, when the Santa Fe ring still moved men around like chess pieces on a board soaked in corruption, and when a woman running a homestead alone was either the bravest creature alive or the most desperate. Theodora Bailey was both, though she would have argued fiercely against either description, standing there in front of the Coldwater Creek General Store with flour on her apron and a list of provisions in her hand, and absolutely no patience for the tall man on the chestnut horse who was watching her from across the main street with an expression she could not quite name. She noticed him because it was impossible not to. He sat his horse the way certain men sit in a room, like the space had simply arranged itself around him without asking his permission. He wore a dusty brown hat pulled low and a coat that had seen better decades, and there was a bedroll tied behind his saddle that suggested he had been on the road for a considerable time. He was perhaps 30, maybe 32, with sun-darkened skin and dark eyes that caught the light in a way that made Theodora feel briefly and inexplicably irritated. She turned away and went inside the store. She did not think about him again until that evening, when she was driving her buckboard back along the Dry Creek Road toward her property 4 miles outside of town, and she saw the orange flicker of a campfire set off the road in the scrub brush. A chestnut horse was picketed nearby. She kept her eyes forward and clicked her tongue at her mule, Hector, and let the road carry her home. Theodora Bailey was 27 years old. She had been a widow for 14 months, and she had spent every single one of those months doing the work of 2 people on a homestead that had never fully cooperated with either of its original occupants. Her husband, Martin Bailey, had been a decent man and a mediocre farmer, and she had loved him in the measured and practical way she did most things, which meant she had genuinely grieved his passing, and then stood up the very next morning and done what needed doing. She had a vegetable garden, 40 acres of hardpan that she leased grazing rights on to a small sheep rancher named Hector Vega, a milk cow named Prudence, and a reputation in Coldwater Creek for being polite, capable, and entirely unapproachable. This suited her fine. The trouble began the next morning when she rode into town for the mail and found Peter Barlow sitting on the steps of the post office eating an apple and looking for all the world like he had been there forever. He stood when she approached, which she noted without meaning to, because not every man in the territory remembered that particular courtesy. "Morning," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, like water moving over smooth stone. "Good morning," she said, and stepped past him into the post office. There was a letter from her sister in Missouri, which she tucked into her coat pocket, and a notice from the land office about a boundary survey scheduled for the following month, which she tucked less carefully, given that the boundary in question had been disputed for 2 years and she expected no good news from it. When she came back out, he was still there. He had finished the apple and was looking at the mountains in the north with the quiet attention of a man who genuinely finds mountains interesting. "You passing through?" she asked, because small towns have their own social laws and acknowledging a stranger's presence costs very little. He turned to look at her, and she saw that his eyes were a dark brown, almost black, and there was something careful and steady in them that was not common enough in men of any era. "Not exactly," he said. She waited. He seemed to understand that she was waiting and was not made uncomfortable by it. "I am looking for work," he said. "Heard there might be some available in this area." "Heard from who?" "Man named Delacourt, down in Las Cruces. Said a widow woman north of Coldwater Creek might be needing a hand." Theodora felt a sharp and specific annoyance rise up in her chest, the kind that comes not from the person standing in front of you, but from the person who sent them. Emmett Delacourt was a well-meaning neighbor who had been trying to find ways to assist her since Martin died, and his methods ranged from the helpful to the maddening. Emmett Delacourt should mind his own affairs, she said. Yes, ma'am, Peter said. He did not smile, but something in his expression suggested he found her response entirely reasonable. I do not need a hand, she said. All right, he said. She got on her horse and rode back toward her property. She did not need a hand, that was true. What she needed was about 6 more hours in every day and considerably better soil, and possibly a different land agent. But she did not need a stranger living on her property and eating her food and looking at her with those careful dark eyes. She had done fine without that. She had done fine. The land dispute came to a head 3 days later, and this is where the story properly begins, because it brought Peter Barlow into her life in a way she could not dismiss with a word and a turned back. A man named Calhoun Greer, who was the representative in this territory of a cattle operation based in Texas, came to her property on a Tuesday morning with 2 riders, and a piece of paper he claimed was a deed to the eastern 40 of her 80 acres. His claim was not entirely without basis in law, which made it considerably more dangerous than an outright lie. There had been a filing error in 1871, before she and Martin had settled, and the land office had been quietly inconsistent about which papers superseded which, and this was apparently the year that the Texas operation had decided to press the issue. Theodora stood on her porch with the shotgun that had belonged to her father across her arms and told Calhoun Greer that he was welcome to take the matter up with the land office, and that, until such a time as a court of law said otherwise, he and his men were trespassing. Greer was the kind of man who had been told yes too many times. He had a thick red face and small eyes, and the particular confidence of someone who had never had to work very hard for what he wanted. He smiled at her in a way that was meant to demonstrate he did not take her seriously, which was a tactical error. Mrs. Bailey, he said, this does not have to be unpleasant. I find that it already is, she said. You are a woman alone out here. It might be better if I would stop there, said a voice from the corner of the porch. Greer and his men turned. Peter Barlow was leaning against the corner post of Theodora's porch, and she had absolutely no idea how long he had been there or how he had arrived, because she had not heard a horse or a footstep. He looked entirely relaxed, which was in itself a kind of threat, because relaxed men either had nothing at stake or a great deal of confidence, and his eyes made clear it was the latter. And who in the hell are you? Greer said. I work here, Peter said. Theodora looked at him. He did not look at her. His eyes were on Greer with the calm, unhurried attention he had given the mountains 2 days ago. The lady made her position clear, Peter said. You know where the land office is. Greer looked between them for a long moment, and whatever calculation he was running came back with an answer that favored caution, because he was a bully rather than a fool, and bullies have good instincts about when the arithmetic is not in their favor. He touched the brim of his hat to Theodora with a mockery of courtesy and turned his horse around, and his men followed, and the 3 of them rode back down the road in a way that was meant to look unhurried but was not quite convincing. The silence they left behind settled over the property like dust after a wagon passes. Theodora lowered the shotgun and looked at Peter Barlow. You said you work here, she said. I did. You do not work here. No, ma'am. Then that was a lie. He was quiet for a moment. He stepped down off the porch and picked up his hat from where it had evidently fallen during some earlier movement and put it back on his head. It was expedient, he said. Greer is the kind of man who recalculates when there is more than one person in the equation. That may be true, she said. It does not mean you were invited. No, he said. It does not. He looked at her steadily. She looked back. There was something in the air between them that was not quite tension and not quite comfort, something that occupied a space she did not have a name for and was not sure she wanted to name. Thank you, she said, for the help. Yes, ma'am. Do not camp on my land. She went inside and shut the door. She stood in her kitchen for a long moment listening to the quiet, and then she went to the window and watched him walk down the lane toward the road, and she was aware that she felt something watching him go that she had no business feeling, which she identified and set aside with the efficiency she applied to most inconvenient things. He came back the next morning. Not to the house. He showed up at the well where she was hauling water before sunrise, and he simply took the other end of the rope and helped her pull without saying a word, and she was too tired and there was too much water to be hauled to send him away, so she did not. When the task was done, he coiled the rope and hung it on the post and said, "If you let me help with the fencing on the east line, I'll sleep in the barn and ask nothing." "Why?" she said. He looked at the eastern sky where the sun was coming up in layers of gold and copper. "Because Greer will be back. And because the east fence line looked ragged when I rode past it yesterday, and that will matter more if you end up in court needing to demonstrate clear use of the land." She stared at him. He was right about the fence. She had known about the fence and had not had the hours to fix it. "You can sleep in the barn," she said. "I will provide meals, that is all." "That is enough," he said. His name, she learned over the following days, was Peter Barlow, and he was from Colorado originally, though he had worked cattle across 4 territories over the past decade. He was 31 years old. He had worked for 2 different outfits before drifting south after a dispute with a foreman that he described without drama or self-pity, and he was quiet in the particular way of men who have spent long stretches alone and have made a kind of peace with their own company. He worked harder than she expected. He was up before she was most mornings, which she discovered when she came out at dawn to find the east fence already half repaired, the posts set with careful precision into the dry ground. He did not ask her opinion on how things should be done, which she appreciated, and he did not offer opinions on how she ran her household, which she appreciated more. He ate dinner at the far end of her kitchen table and listened when she talked, which was not often, and spoke when she asked him something, and the days began to take on a rhythm that she told herself was simply practical and no more. It was Emmett Delacourt who first said what others in town were apparently already thinking, when she ran into him at the general store on a Friday afternoon 2 weeks after Peter had appeared. "Barlow still at your place?" Emmett said with the careful casualness of someone who has rehearsed their casualness. "He is helping with some repairs," she said. "Good man from what I hear, straight shooter. Had good words for him from the rancher over in Cimarron who let him go when the cattle contract fell through." She stopped selecting the nails she needed from the bin and looked at Emmett directly. He had the decency to look slightly sheepish. "You wrote to that rancher," she said. "I may have made an inquiry," he said. "Emmett. Theo, I just wanted to know he was solid. A woman alone, a stranger showing up, it makes a man want to check." She loved Emmett Delacourt in the way one loves a neighbor who means well and cannot quite stop meddling, which is a love that comes with a certain amount of resigned exasperation. She paid for her nails and did not say anything further about it. But she thought about it on the ride home. She thought about Emmett making inquiries and what that said about what he saw when he looked at her and Peter Barlow occupying the same property. She thought about the fact that she was a widow and there were rules about such things, unwritten, and all the more powerful for being unwritten. And she thought about what it meant that she had not thought about any of this until Emmett mentioned it. That evening Peter came in from repairing the windmill with his shirt dark from the work and his hat in his hand, and she had a plate ready for him because she had started doing that without thinking. And when she set it in front of him, she said, "People in town will talk." He looked up at her. About you being here." He was quiet for a moment. "I can go," he said, "if that is what you need." "I did not say that." "What did you say?" She sat down across from him, which was something she had been doing less deliberately lately and more automatically, and she looked at the table surface for a moment. "I said people will talk. I did not say I have decided what to do about it." He nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "I will follow your lead." She found this answer oddly satisfying and tried not to examine why. The land dispute moved forward in the way territorial land disputes moved forward, which is to say slowly and with a great deal of paper and a hearing date that was set for the end of June, and then reset for the middle of July. Peter helped her prepare the documentation, sitting at her kitchen table in the evenings with a lamp between them while she organized the deeds and survey maps, and he read through them with a patience and literacy that surprised her. "Where did you learn to read like that?" she asked one evening because he was moving through the legal language with a facility that was not common. "Missouri," he said. "My mother was a school teacher. She had opinions about reading." "What happened to Missouri?" He looked up from the papers. The lamplight put warm shadows across his face. "My father died when I was 16. There was nothing keeping us there, and my mother had a sister in Denver. We went west." He paused. "My mother passed 5 years ago, fever." "I am sorry." "She was good," he said simply, which was not a complete answer but was somehow a whole one. She told him about Missouri too, eventually, not in one conversation, but in pieces over many evenings. The way information moves between people who are becoming familiar without declaring themselves familiar. She had grown up near Independence, one of 3 daughters of a man who ran a dry goods store. She had come west with Martin when she was 23 because Martin had ideas about land and opportunity that had been more hopeful than realistic but not entirely wrong. They had built what they built. Martin had died of a lung inflammation in the deep cold of February 1877, and she had buried him on the north side of the property under the cottonwood he had always liked, and she had gotten up the next day and kept going. "That is what you do," she said one evening, not explaining who she meant by you because it covered everyone she knew. "Yes," he said, "that is what you do." There was a pause in the conversation that was not uncomfortable. The wind moved outside. The lamp flame bent once. "Why did you really come here?" she said. "Not Delacourt's recommendation, the real reason." He was very still for a moment, then he said, "I was drifting." And drifting gets lonesome after a while, and when something pulls at you, you follow it. "What pulled at you here?" He looked at her. "I am not sure I can answer that honestly without making things awkward," he said. She felt heat rise along her neck and was glad the lamplight was forgiving. "Then do not answer it," she said, and stood and began clearing the table, and he helped, and they did not speak of it again that night. But it was there in the room between them like a piece of furniture they were both carefully walking around. The week before the land hearing, Calhoun Greer made another visit. This time he came alone, and in the early afternoon when Peter was out at the far end of the property and Theodora was hanging laundry in the side yard, Greer dismounted with a different manner than before, slower and more deliberate, and he held his hat in his hands in a way that was meant to look respectful. "Mrs. Bailey," he said, "I wanted to have a private word." "You may speak," she said, continuing to hang the laundry. "The Texas men I represent are willing to make a fair offer for the eastern portion. Cash money, no court, no trouble." She hung a sheet. "How much?" He named a figure. "It was not nothing. It was not fair." "That is below the surveyed value," she said. "It accounts for the uncertainty in the title," he said smoothly. "The uncertainty in the title is something your employers manufactured," she said. "I have a lawyer in Santa Fe who disagrees with your interpretation of the 1871 filing, and I intend to press that disagreement in court." Greer put his hat back on. The courteous manner fell away like a coat he had been holding for a period he now considered over. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "A woman without a husband, without capital, against a Texas land company. You know how those stories end." "I know how some of them end," she said. "I intend to write a different one." He rode away. Her hands were steady on the next sheet she pinned to the line. She was aware that they might not stay steady forever, but they were steady now, and now was what mattered. Peter rode back an hour later and found her sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, and she told him about Greer's visit with a precision that she had learned produced the clearest responses. He listened without interrupting, his elbows on his knees and his hat off, and his dark eyes on the middle distance while she talked. "He will try again," Peter said when she finished. "Probably. Before the hearing." "That is what I think," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Do you want me to be here when he does?" She considered this carefully, which was her way with anything that mattered. "I want you to be here because you have been useful," she said, "not because I cannot manage alone." "I know the difference," he said. "Do you?" He looked at her then, full and direct. "Theodora," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and it fell into the air between them with a weight she had not expected. "I have watched you for 6 weeks. I know exactly what you are capable of. I am not here because I think you cannot stand on your own. I am here because I want to be." The silence after that was different from other silences. It had edges. "That is a complicated thing to say," she said. "I know it is." She stood and went inside, and he did not follow, and she stood in her kitchen and pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed carefully until her heart did what she told it to. She had been very careful with herself since Martin died. She had allowed herself grief, and she had allowed herself loneliness, and she had not allowed herself hope, because hope required something she was not ready to risk, which was the possibility of loss again. Loss was not something you survived easily twice. She was not sure she had properly survived it the first time. She had simply continued, which she understood was not the same thing. But Peter Barlow was making it very difficult to continue in her previous manner, and this annoyed her deeply, which was itself an informative response. The night before the land hearing in Coldwater Creek, which was being presided over by a circuit judge named Harlan who rode down from Taos twice a year and was known to be fair if not particularly fast, there was a storm. Not a violent one, but a steady soaking rain that turned the dry creek road into a mud channel and made the 40-mile ride to Santa Fe impossible, even if her lawyer had not already been on his way from that direction. Peter spent the afternoon ensuring that the barn and the outbuildings were secure against the water, and when he came in for supper, he was thoroughly soaked and somewhat cheerful about it, which she found disorienting because she was not accustomed to cheerful. Martin had not been a gloomy man, but he had taken weather as a personal insult, as many farmers did, and she had absorbed that tendency and wore it without questioning it until this moment, watching Peter Barlow shake rain off his hat in her kitchen doorway and look entirely unbothered. "Supper," she said. "Sit down." He sat. She served them both. The rain rattled the single window in the kitchen and the lamp made the room into its own small world. "Are you worried about tomorrow?" he asked. "I am always worried," she said. "I have learned not to let it drive the decisions. That is wise." "It is necessary," she said. "There is a difference." He smiled then. It was the first real smile she had seen from him, not the small contained variations he usually produced, but a full one, and it changed his face in a way that was very uncomfortable for her equanimity. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I just think you are remarkable." She looked at her plate. "Do not do that. I apologize." "Do not apologize either, just." She stopped. "All right," he said, and they finished supper in a quiet that was different from their usual quiets, denser and more aware. When she rose to clear the plates, he rose too, and in the small kitchen they moved around each other with the unconscious navigation of people who have learned each other's physical rhythms, and she passed close to him reaching for the pot on the stove, and his hand came up and briefly, with a lightness that was almost not there, touched her wrist. She stopped. He did not move. His hand was still on her wrist, barely, and she could feel the warmth of it through her sleeve. "Theodora," he said quietly. "Peter." She said his name deliberately, because she had been careful not to use it, and she meant the use of it now as an acknowledgement of something. "I am not going to pretend any more that I am here simply because you need help with the fence," he said. "I know you are not," she said. "I know it is too soon," he said. "I know you have a year's grief behind you and a court case in front of you and every reason to tell me to go. I am not going to push. I cannot keep standing here pretending I feel nothing. It is not honest, and I think you deserve honesty." She turned to look at him. He was close enough that she could see the exact shade of his eyes and the tension in his jaw that betrayed how carefully he was holding himself still. He had shaved recently, she noticed for no particular reason, and there was a small scar at the corner of his jaw that she had not noticed before. "What is it you want?" she asked. "To try," he said. That is all, just to try. If it is nothing, if you feel nothing and you never will, I will go and I will go quietly. But I would like the chance to know. And if I say no, then I leave in the morning, he said, after the hearing. She looked at him for a long moment. The rain continued outside. The lamp flame was steady. I am not ready to say yes, she said finally. I understand. I am not saying no either, she said. He breathed once, careful and deliberate. All right, he said. I am saying, she stopped, choosing words. I am saying the hearing is tomorrow, and I am trying to keep my house and my land, and after that I will think clearly about everything else. That is fair, he said. She stepped back gently and his hand released her wrist, and she finished clearing the table, and he went to bed in the barn, and she sat up for a long time listening to the rain and thinking, with an honesty she rarely applied to herself, about what she actually felt. What she felt was frightening. Not because it was bad, but because it was large, larger than she had expected, and she was not a woman who liked being surprised by the size of her own feelings. She was organized and practical, and she ran a tight operation. She had not organized herself for this. But she lay awake in the rain and thought about the way he listened, truly listened, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually receiving what she said, and the way he had stood at the corner of her porch and faced down Calhoun Greer with that absolute quiet confidence, and the way he had smiled, that one true smile across the supper table, and she thought about what it would mean to be alone on this property for 30 more years. She thought about a great many things. In the morning, the rain had stopped and the world was washed clean, and the mountains were sharp and clear against a sky that was the blue of best china. And she drove the buckboard into Coldwater Creek for the hearing with Peter riding alongside on his chestnut horse, neither of them speaking much. But the silence was companionable, and she noticed she was not dreading the day the way she had expected to. The hearing took place in the back room of the Coldwater Creek courthouse, which was also sometimes the meeting room for the town council, and smelled faintly of pipe smoke and old paper. Judge Harlan was a compact man with a gray beard who had the manner of someone who had seen too many of these disputes to be impressed by either side's dramatics, which Theodora found reassuring. Her Santa Fe lawyer, a man named Aldrich who wore suits that seemed out of place in the territory, and made up for this with an extremely precise knowledge of land law, presented her case with methodical clarity. He demonstrated that the original filing error had been introduced through a clerical mislabeling at the land office, and that her husband's subsequent corrected filing in 1873 had been entered into the record and should have superseded the earlier error. He had documentation. He had the surveyor's testimony written out and notarized. He was good. The Texas operations lawyer was also good, and they went back and forth for most of the morning, and Theodora sat at the table with her hands folded and listened to every word and let none of it show on her face, which took some effort. Peter sat in the back row of the room. He was quiet and still, and she could feel his presence behind her the way you can sometimes feel warmth from a fireplace across a room. Judge Harlan took a recess after the morning session and came back at 2 in the afternoon with his ruling, which was thorough, and which went in Theodora's favor on the central question of the Eastern 40. The corrected 1873 filing was valid. The land was hers. The Texas company could pursue further action through the territorial courts if they chose, but that path was an expensive and uncertain one, and Harlan made clear he had limited patience for it. Calhoun Greer, who had been present throughout with his small eyes and his thick red face, was the color of a fire brick by the time the ruling concluded. He spoke a few words to his lawyer and left without looking at Theodora. She thanked Aldrich, who collected his papers and headed back to Santa Fe before the day was further advanced, and she walked out of the courthouse into the afternoon light and stood on the board sidewalk and breathed. Peter came out behind her and stood beside her, not touching, just present. "Congratulations," he said. "Thank you," she said. She felt the release of months of tension moving through her slowly like a flood receding, leaving the ground underneath exposed and surprisingly solid. She had not been certain the ground was solid until now. Now she knew it was. She turned to look at him. He was squinting slightly in the afternoon light, his hat casting a shadow across his eyes, and there was something careful and still about his expression, like a man waiting for a verdict of his own. "Come to supper," she said, "properly, not as a hand I am tolerating, as a guest." Something shifted in his face. "Yes," he said, "I will." They rode back to the property in the clean afternoon, and she cooked a better supper than usual, using the small store of things she had been saving without quite admitting she was saving them, and set the table with care. And when he came in from checking on the animals, he washed up and sat down, and she served them both and they ate together. And for the first time since he had arrived, she talked to him, not about the property or the legal situation, but about other things, about a book she had been reading, about the spring she had seen a mountain lion on the North Ridge, and what it had felt like to stand there alone looking at something that beautiful and dangerous, about her sister in Missouri who wrote letters that were either extremely cheerful or extremely dire and nothing in between. He talked too. He told her about Colorado before it was a state, the way the mountains there were different from the mountains here, more severe, less forgiving. He told her about a season he spent working cattle in a high country above the tree line, and the way the silence up there was different from any other silence, so profound it had a sound of its own. He told her about the outfit he had ridden with for 3 years, good men mostly, and the one who had not been, and how that had ended his time there. They talked until the lamp burned low, and then they sat in the dimness with their coffee cups and the comfortable exhaustion of people who have given a full day to difficult things and are now resting honestly. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "If I had said no, last night, would you really have left?" He was quiet for a moment. "I said I would." "That is not what I asked." He looked at the table's surface, then he looked at her. "I do not know," he said. "I think I would have. I am not a man who stays where he is not wanted." He paused. "But I am not sure I could have made myself entirely believe you did not want me here. I have been watching you too carefully for too long to be convinced of that." "That is a very honest answer," she said. "You asked for honest." "I did." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I was not going to say no," she said. "I want you to know that. I am not saying yes yet either, but I was not going to say no." "All right," he said softly. "I am cautious," she said. "That is who I am. I do not apologize for it. I would not ask you to. And I am proud," she said. "Which means I find it difficult to need anything. Which means that when you came here and I did need help and you provided it, I was grateful and also furious about being grateful, which is probably not very fair to you." He smiled, that real smile again. "I noticed," he said. "I suspected you had. For what it is worth," he said, leaning forward slightly, his forearms on the table, "it was never about you needing help. It was about me needing something too. People do not always admit that." She looked at him across the table. The lamp was very low now and the room was soft, and she thought that he was one of the most genuinely good people she had encountered in a long time, and that this was terrifying, because things you genuinely value are things you can genuinely lose. "I am afraid," she said, and it cost her something to say it because she was not a woman who said such things easily. "Not of you. Of what happens if I trust it and it falls apart. I have rebuilt once. I'm not certain I could rebuild again." "I know," he said. He did not offer her assurances she could not verify. He simply said, "I know. So you understand why I am slow." "I understand." She nodded. She stood and took the cups to the basin. He rose too, and they did the small tasks of ending the evening, and when he put on his hat to go out to the barn, he paused at the door and looked back at her. "Theodora," he said. "Yes, I am not going anywhere." She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. "That is the thing I keep returning to." He went out. She blew out the last lamp and stood in the dark of her kitchen for a moment and let herself feel everything she had been managing carefully. And what she felt, held honestly, was something that had not been there when she woke up that morning, even though it had clearly been building for a long time, something that sat in her chest with a warmth that was frightening and specific in hers. She went to bed. She slept better than she had in 14 months. The following weeks moved with the particular quality of time when something important is developing, but has not yet declared itself, when every day adds to a structure whose shape is still becoming clear. Peter continued to work the property with the same tireless competence, and she continued to run the house and manage the lease arrangements with Hector Vega, and correspond with Aldrich about the Texas company's unlikely, but not impossible appeals. The rhythm of their days became something she found herself looking forward to in the mornings, and she thought this was itself a kind of answer. They began to take their evening meals with a different energy, talking longer, laughing occasionally, which was something she had forgotten she could do naturally with another person present. He had a dry and quiet sense of humor that surfaced unexpectedly, and that she found she was attuned to in a way she had not been attuned to another person's humor since her father had been alive. Emmett Delacourt came out to the property one Saturday to return a borrowed tool, and found them in the yard talking over the plan for a second water cistern, and the look on his face was one of such pure and barely contained delight that Theodora was torn between laughing and throwing something at him. "Looking well," Emmett said to Peter, shaking his hand. "Thank you, Emmett," Peter said, in a tone that was perfectly pleasant and entirely unrevealing. "Productive looks like," Emmett said, gesturing vaguely at the improved east fence and the newly repaired windmill and the cistern plan spread on the fence post. "We have been keeping busy," Theodora said. Emmett left eventually, barely managing to contain his very visible opinion of the situation, and she and Peter stood in the yard and watched the dust of his departure and then looked at each other, and she laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from the belly and is impossible to perform, and he laughed too, and it was the best sound she had heard in a very long time. "He means well," she said. "He does," Peter agreed. "He was right, for what it is worth, to send me here." She looked at him sideways. "Do not let him know you said that. He will be insufferable." "I would not dream of it." It was on a Sunday in early August, when the heat was serious, and the afternoon sky built up its daily towers of white cloud over the mountains, that she came to a decision. She had been approaching it for some time, the way one approaches a river crossing, finding the current and the footing before committing. And on that Sunday she found herself at the north edge of the property, standing at Martin's grave under the cottonwood, which she did occasionally, not with great grief any more, but with a kind of respectful acknowledgment of what had been and what it had meant. She stood there for a while with her hat in her hands and the wind moving the cottonwood leaves above her, and she thought about Martin, who had been a decent man and had tried his best, and who she was fairly certain would not have wanted her to stand alone at a fence line until she died of stubbornness. She thought about what she wanted, not what was sensible or what was expected or what would avoid risk, what she actually wanted. She went and found Peter at the east cistern he had been digging for 3 days, which was taking shape now, the walls straight and the depth progressing, and she stood at the edge and looked down at him in the hole with his shirt off and the dirt dark on his arms and his hat pushed back on his head, and he looked up and saw her expression and straightened. "What is wrong?" he said. "Nothing is wrong," she said. "Come out of the hole." He came out of the hole, pulling himself up the rope ladder he had rigged, and stood in front of her, brushing dirt from his hands and looking at her with that careful attention. "I have been thinking," she said. "All right. About what you said in the kitchen. About wanting to try." His expression did not change exactly, but something in it became very still. "I have decided," she said, "that I would like to try also." He was quiet for a moment that felt long. "Theodora," he said. "I am not making any large declarations," she said. "I am saying I would like us to be honest about what this is and see where it goes. I am saying I am not going to keep pretending I feel nothing when I do, because it is dishonest and I do not like dishonesty." He looked at her. The afternoon light was behind her and she could not quite read his expression against it, and then he stepped forward and she felt his hands come up to her face, warm and careful, and he looked at her for a moment with an expression that was so open and unguarded that she had to look directly at it because it was so rare to see a person completely unguarded. "All right," he said quietly. "We try." "We try," she said. He did not kiss her then. He held her face in his hands and looked at her with those dark eyes and then pressed his forehead gently against hers, and they stood like that for a moment in the afternoon quiet with the cottonwood moving somewhere on the north edge and the mountains enormous and patient on the horizon. Then he straightened and smiled and said, "I should probably put my shirt on." She laughed. "You probably should," she said. That evening they sat on the porch after supper and watched the sky go from gold to rose to the deep blue of dusk, and he sat close enough that their arms touched along the length, and she let that happen and did not move away. And above them, the first stars appeared over the mountains one by one in their old and patient configurations, and she felt the thing in her chest that had been frightening resolve itself into something that was also large but was warm rather than frightening. Or was frightening in a way that she could bear. "Tell me about Colorado," she said, and he did. The summer moved into its deep heat, and then began its long turn toward fall, and things between them moved the way genuine things move, not in dramatic leaps, but in incremental and solid progress, like the cistern growing a few feet deeper each day, until one morning it was finished and full of water, and simply a fact of the landscape that had always been going to be there. He asked her to walk with him one evening when the heat had broken, and the air had the first breath of September in it, and they walked the perimeter of the property in the fading light, and he asked her about every part of it with the genuine curiosity of someone who is interested in the details, because he intends to be present for them for a long time. He asked about the lease with Hector Vega, and whether she had considered expanding the vegetable garden toward the south fence line where the soil was better, and she told him what she had been thinking about that, and they discussed it with the easy practicality of two people whose lives have begun to occupy the same set of concerns. He stopped at the south fence line and looked at the distant mountains and then looked at her. The sky was pink and the mountains were purple and his face was in shadow, and he was, she thought, the most straightforward person she had ever known, which was rare and worth a great deal. "I need to say something," he said. "Say it. I think you know what I am going to say." "Say it anyway," she said. "I think some things deserve to be said plainly." He turned fully toward her. "I am in love with you," he said. "I think I have been since somewhere around the second week. I know the timing is complicated, and I know you are careful with yourself, and I am not asking you to say anything in return right now. I said I would be honest, and this is the honest thing." She stood and looked at him in the pink evening light with the mountains behind him and the property around them, and 14 months of careful and solitary determination behind her and the future in front of her that was no longer as visible as the mountains but that she could feel. The way you can feel a fire before you see it, its warmth arriving before you turn the corner. "Peter," she said. "Yes." "I love you too," she said. "I have been avoiding the word because once you say a thing it is said. But I love you. I think I have been loving you since you stood on my porch and looked at Calhoun Greer without flinching, which is an odd time to fall in love with someone, but apparently that is who I am." He was very still for a moment. Then he crossed the small distance between them and she let him. And when he kissed her, it was the way he did everything, careful and steady and without pretense. And she kissed him back with the particular relief of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and has finally been given a safe place to set it down. They were married on an October Saturday when the cottonwood had gone to gold, and the mountains were capped with the first snow of the season, and the sky was the deepest clean blue that October sometimes produces in the New Mexico territory, as if by way of apology for what is coming. Emmett Delacourt officiated, because he also happened to be a justice of the peace, and was nearly incandescent with satisfaction at being allowed to do so, and Hector Vega and his wife Rosa came, and a few of the women from town who had moved from cautious observation to warm approval of Theodora's situation over the preceding months, And the ceremony was small and direct, and exactly what both of them wanted. She wore the blue dress she had made from fabric she had been saving for something but had not known what, and she carried the last of the autumn wildflowers from the meadow along the creek. And Peter stood in front of her in a clean coat and his best hat, and looked at her with such unambiguous love that Rosa Vega produced a handkerchief. And Emmett Delacourt's voice, to his evident embarrassment, wavered once during the reading. Peter's vows were his own words, not the standard words, and he said them in a quiet voice that was only for her, about permanence and honesty, and the particular honor he felt in being trusted by someone who did not give trust easily. And she thought she would remember the exact way his voice sounded in the October air for the rest of her life. She said her own vows with the precision and steadiness that was her particular quality, and meant every word of them fully, and he knew she meant them, which was the point of saying them plainly. Rosa Vega had brought food enough for twice the number of people present, and Emmett had brought 2 bottles of good wine from some reserve he had been guarding, and they ate and drank in the afternoon sun on Theodora's porch, which was now Peter's porch too, and the mountains watched over them with their enormous, impassive approval. After the others had gone and the sun was down and the cold was coming in fast from the mountains the way it does in October, they sat together in the kitchen with the stove going and the lamp lit and the sound of the coyotes starting up on the far ridge, and she thought this was what it felt like to have arrived somewhere, to stop moving towards something and simply be within it. "Happy," he said. "Yes," she said, and it was not a complicated answer. He reached across and took her hand on the table. She turned her hand and held his. The months that followed were good ones. The Texas operation did not pursue further appeals, whether because Greer had run the numbers or because someone in their operation had made the decision that Theodora Bailey's Eastern 40 was not worth the continued legal expense and uncertainty. The letter from Aldrich confirming this arrived in November, and she read it twice, and then set it in the pile of important papers, and told Peter over breakfast, and he nodded with the satisfaction of a man for whom justice, while not inevitable, is genuinely pleasing when it arrives. The vegetable garden was expanded toward the south fence line in the spring as they had planned, and the second cistern became the reliable water source during the dry summer that the first could not have handled alone, and they negotiated a better lease rate with Hector Vega when he expanded his flock and needed more of the grazing land, which gave them the capital to repair the house roof properly before the following winter. Peter was good at all of it. Not in the frantic way of someone trying to prove something, but in the steady way of someone who has found the work he is meant to do and the place he is meant to do it. He woke every morning with a purpose that Theodora found she matched, and they moved through their days with the particular efficiency of 2 people who communicate without the waste of words, because they have learned each other's thinking well enough to anticipate it. They were not without their difficulties. She was proud and he was stubborn, and there were arguments, real ones, usually about money, and about whose judgment to follow on the decisions that required choosing between 2 uncertain paths. She was more conservative, and he was more willing to risk, and they did not always agree on where the line was. But they argued honestly, which meant they resolved things, and they had made an early understanding that no disagreement would be carried into silence for more than a day, which proved to be one of the most practical decisions they had made. In the spring of 1880, Theodora discovered she was expecting a child. She knew before she was certain, the way women know things about their own bodies, and she carried the knowledge for a week before she told Peter, turning it over in private, making sure she understood what she felt about it, which was enormous complicated joy with some significant anxiety underneath it. She told him on a Sunday morning while they were drinking their coffee before the day's work, and she watched his face change through a series of expressions that ended at something so open and unguarded and full that she had to look away for a moment. "Theo," he said. "I know," she said. "When?" "August, I think." He set down his cup and came around the table and pulled her against him in the kind of embrace that is not about romance, but about something deeper, about two people recognizing the scale of what they have made together. And she pressed her face against the front of his shirt and allowed herself to feel all of it, the joy and the fear, and the enormous strange beauty of the future arriving in the form of something not yet visible. The summer was hot and she worked through most of it, sensibly and not to excess, and Peter fussed at a level she found both touching and moderately irritating, and she told him so, and he said he would try to moderate the fussing, and then continued to monitor where she was every half hour or so, which she chose to accept because it came from love, and love of this particular kind was not something she was willing to take for granted. Their son was born on the 14th of August, 1880, delivered by Rosa Vega, who had attended every birth in the surrounding territory for 20 years, and who declared the boy healthy and large, and in possession of his father's chin, which Peter disputed, and which Theodora confirmed was entirely accurate. They named him James, after Theodora's father, and Peter held him that first evening with an expression of such absolute and helpless love that Theodora, who was tired and aching and profoundly satisfied, felt her eyes fill and did nothing to stop it, because there was no one present who was not entitled to see her cry at this particular moment. James Bailey Barlow grew his first months in the way of all babies, which is to say in a manner that was simultaneously remarkable and exhausting, and Theodora and Peter discovered that the efficiency of their days needed significant reorganization around the requirements of a small person with enormous opinions about his own comfort. They managed. They were good at managing, individually and together, which was why they had found each other, or why they had recognized each other when they did. Emmett Delacourt was the boy's godfather, which was perhaps predictable but was entirely right. He came to visit monthly and held the baby with the careful reverence of a man who loves children and has not had his own, and always brought something, a toy carved from pine or a length of cloth, or once, magnificently, a small painted tin drum that Peter confiscated after 12 minutes on grounds of sanity. Rosa Vega was the godmother, and she came with practical food and practical wisdom, and called James her heart, which he was, in the extended and generous way that Rosa Vega's heart had always operated. The territory was changing around them during these years. The Lincoln County War had burned itself out the year before Peter arrived, and the peace that followed was imperfect but real, and the arrival of the railroad was changing the calculus of the entire region, moving goods and people faster and beginning the process by which the wild territory would eventually become something more ordered. This was both loss and gain, as most changes are. There were still difficulties, still the ambient tensions of a place where law was not yet entirely settled, and where men with more power than virtue were always operating somewhere on the horizon. But Coldwater Creek was finding its footing, and the people who had chosen to root themselves there were for the most part people of sufficient determination to make something of what they had. Theodora Bailey Barlow was one of them. This was understood by everyone who knew her. Peter Barlow was another. This was understood by everyone who had watched him stand on a porch and face down a bully without flinching, and by everyone who had seen him work a piece of land like it mattered, and by everyone who had seen the way he looked at his wife, which was the way certain men look at things they understand to be the best part of their existence, and do not bother to pretend otherwise. 3 years after James arrived, in the late spring of 1883, Theodora told Peter she was expecting again. This time she told him immediately, not because the caution that had caused her to wait before was gone, but because she was different now than she had been, less alone inside herself, more willing to share the large things as they were rather than after she had processed them privately. He received this news with the same open expression as before and the same helpless joy, and she loved him for it, for not pretending that the second time was less significant, for understanding that each thing was its own thing. Their second child was a girl, born in December of 1883, and they named her Clara, after Peter's mother. She arrived in a snowstorm, which Rosa Vega navigated without visible concern, and she was small and dark-haired and possessed from her very first hours of an alert and focused gaze that her grandmother, had she been alive to see it, would have recognized immediately as the gaze of someone who intends to understand the world thoroughly before deciding what to make of it. James, who was 3.5 by this time, accepted his sister with the philosophical resignation of the eldest child, who understands that the situation has been decided without consulting him, and that his best option is adaptation. He adapted. Within 2 weeks he was her primary champion and protector, a role he occupied with great seriousness and some drama. The property that had once been Martin Bailey's uncertain dream had become something solid and established. The east fence line was tight and well-maintained. The cisterns were full. The vegetable garden produced abundantly and sent surplus to the Coldwater Creek market. The lease with Hector Vega was renewed annually and represented reliable income. The house had been added onto twice, a necessary expansion given its new occupants, and was now a structure of considerable respectability with a covered porch all along the front that Theodora had insisted on, and Peter had built over a single focused week. It was on that porch that they spent their evenings when the work allowed, the children asleep inside, the night open and enormous around the property, the mountains dark against the star-heavy sky. She would sit in the chair she had claimed from the first day, and he would sit in the one beside it, and they would talk or be quiet in equal parts, and she thought on many of those evenings that happiness was not the dramatic thing she had understood it to be when she was young, not a peak but a plain, wide and navigable, a terrain you could live on rather than just visit. She thought about the woman she had been when he arrived, standing in front of the general store with flour on her apron, and a kind of absolute determination to not need anything from anyone. She thought about the campfire she had seen from the road, that orange flicker in the scrub brush, and the irritation she had felt at his presence on the post office steps, and how completely she had not known then what was already beginning. "Peter," she said one evening in early autumn, the children newly settled for the night and the air just cool enough for the pleasure of a shawl. "Yes," he said. He was reading, or had been, the book held loosely in his hand now. "Do you remember the day you arrived?" "I do." "I thought you were trouble," she said. He smiled. The porch lamp put light along the side of his face. "I recall that impression." "You were trouble," she said. "I was," he said comfortably. "You are still trouble," she said. He looked at her. "You would be bored," he said, "without a little trouble." She considered arguing with this and found she could not, honestly. "Possibly," she said. He reached over and took her hand the way he had done at the kitchen table 5 years ago, and she turned her hand and held his. And above them the stars were the same stars that had watched the territory before any of them were there and would watch it long after, indifferent and magnificent. And below them the land was theirs, worked and tended and genuinely theirs. And inside the house the children were sleeping. James in his bed with the wooden horse Peter had carved for his 2nd birthday, and Clara with the quilt Rosa had made, and everything that had been in question was answered. Not that there would not be new questions. There always were. The territory would continue to change, and they would change with it, and the children would grow into their own questions, and the work would always be work. But the essential thing was answered, the thing that had been a question since the morning she had stood at the window watching a tall man in a dusty hat walk away down the lane and felt something she had not known how to name. "Peter," she said. "I am glad you stayed." He turned to look at her, and in the lamplight his face was the face she had come to know completely, every line of it, every shade of expression, the exact way his eyes changed when he was amused versus when he was moved, and right now they were both, which was the combination she loved best. "I told you," he said quietly. "I was not going anywhere." "You told me," she agreed. "I chose not to fully believe you. And now," she squeezed his hand. She looked out at the mountains, dark and enormous and patient beyond all human impatience, and at the stars, and at the land she had fought for and kept, and at the man beside her who had refused to leave it until she gave him the chance to prove that some things are worth the waiting and the risk and the terrifying act of saying yes. "Now," she said, "I believe you." He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth against her knuckles, and she felt the warmth of it travel up her arm and settle in her chest where it had always been going, in the place she had thought was closed, and that turned out to simply have been waiting for the right person to stand at the door with sufficient patience and sufficient love, and absolutely no intention of riding away. The cottonwood on the north edge of the property moved in the October wind, its last gold leaves releasing one by one into the dark, and the coyotes sang their old song on the far ridge, and the mountains stood where they had always stood, and in the house the children slept their deep and untroubled sleep, and on the porch Theodora Bailey Barlow and Peter Barlow sat together in the lamplight holding hands while the autumn night moved around them, enormous and full and entirely theirs. The stars were very bright that night. They always were, out there in the territory, far from the smoke and noise of the coming century, in the last years of a world that was passing, and in the first years of a life that was only beginning. She did not know what the future held because no one does, but she knew who she would face it with, and she knew that the land was solid under her feet, and she knew that the man beside her had ridden in from the horizon one ordinary morning and had, through patience and honesty and a love he had never thought to conceal, become the most necessary fact of her world. And she was grateful. Not in the reluctant way she had once been grateful for things that surprised her, but in the full and open way of someone who has learned that receiving is not weakness, but its own kind of courage, its own kind of choice, the choice to open your hands and let the good things in when they come. The lamp burned steadily on the porch. Inside, James murmured something in his sleep and went quiet. Clara did not stir. The night deepened and the mountains held their ground and the stars moved in their slow and ancient arcs, and below them, on a piece of land that had been fought for and kept and loved into something real, a woman and a man sat together in the comfortable silence of people who know they are home. This is the way good things end, not with a flourish, but with this. Two hands joined in the lamplight, the night wide open around them, and everything that matters already here.